So we're at Emerce eDay talking to Maggie Coblentz, researcher at the MIT Media Lab. What are you doing?
I'm a researcher at the MIT Media Lab Space Exploration, designing the future of food for space. So thinking more holistically about the human lived experience of space. So what will culture be in space? What will our eating experiences be to promote both well-being for long duration space travel for astronauts and also to think more speculatively about the future of space travel.
And what types of time horizons are you doing this research for?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
What time horizon? Is it 2050, 2100?
Gotcha. So near term would be creating food products for astronauts currently living on the International Space Station. And then the next generation would be designing food for low orbit space tourism and future habitats on the moon. And then could be 2050 when we go to Mars one day, and then even looking beyond that to interplanetary travel and fusion cuisine.
And does food differ in space compared to Earth? And if yes, why?
Yes, so the current space food system produced by NASA is all plastic wrapped and freeze dried to meet the standards of that environment. We're trying to redesign that because we know from astronauts that they don't taste food as well, so they have fluid shifts in the body, which means that their sensory perception is deprived. Aroma dissipates in all different directions in zero gravity, so we're trying to combat that by elevating the sensory experience via VR, via other sensory modalities so that we can help improve how food tastes.
And space food, where is it currently being produced? And let's say 100 years from now, how will this change?
Space food is currently being produced by, well, at least NASA's food lab is producing their space food, so in the United States. But one day, hopefully, food is actually produced in space itself. So we're really interested in situ resource utilization. So how could chefs actually cook in space on another planet in the International Space Station? What types of cooking equipment and ingredients would be required to have an entire eating experience in space?
I'm quite fascinated by what you're doing. You work quite in the future. To what extent is this an art versus a science?
I think it's both, and in true Media Lab spirit, we're really interested in bringing together artists and designers with scientists and engineers. And so we view it as both, and we also always want there to be a strong narrative through all of our work. So I think that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
And does your work end with analysis and recommendations, or you also act?
It does. So it's a little bit of both. We start with analysis and recommendations and then try something out, and then we sort of reiterate that process until we get it right. So as an example, later this year we're sending samples of fermented food to the International Space Station for 30 days to explore how flavors might evolve in the environment of space. And then when we get that back, we'll analyze it from a microbiological level to see if the flavors actually did evolve. And then from there we might design new recipes and experiences based on those findings.
You're talking about food, I'm also thinking about beverages. So what do people drink in space? How does that landscape look like?
We're looking at both food and beverages. Right now, astronauts are drinking coffee. That's one of our human morning rituals, and sort of standard drinks. I don't think we have alcohol in space yet, but space tourism will certainly demand that, I'm sure. So we're interested in, we have one researcher who's proposed the idea of a spherical cocktail, and could you incept different flavors through liquids floating in space? You don't need cups anymore. So it could be an entirely different experience for drinking.
For instance, cocktails, would alcohol be allowed in space, or that's a different story?
I think that with the emergence of space tourism, I think that they probably will be allowed. I don't think that tourism can exist without alcohol, but maybe that's just my own personal desire. But astronauts are not currently supposed to be drinking alcohol in space.
And in terms of, let's say, 2050, what is the volume of people being in space yearly? I don't have a clue.
I don't really have a clue either. I think we're about to discover how that changes. I think that it will probably be small numbers at first. 2050 is not actually that far away. It's going to be very expensive still, so probably exclusive to certain part of society. But I think that it will open up to a broader population as long as we can be conscientious about the environmental footprint, of course, that space travel has.
What is your background, and how have you ended up in this field?
That's a good question. I don't quite know how I ended up in this field. My background is actually in fashion design, and then I studied industrial design. And through that design thinking, I was really interested in looking at food and all of these different extreme environments, space being one of them. I think what I thought was just a speculative thesis project turned into a job just because of the way that the space industry is evolving. And so I sort of found myself partly by accident.
That's a very interesting career. Maybe my last question, what is your main message for, let's say, the Dutch audience that is listening to this interview?
I think my main message would be how can we use extreme environments such as space to learn about human condition, human behavior, and how we want to interact with products. So when we're removed from our typical creature comforts, what kinds of things do we want to bring with us, and what types of behaviors persist even in these really remote conditions. And I think that that can inspire industry here on this planet.
Thank you very much, Maggie.